Welcome back to Voices of the Regenerative Decade here at One Earth Live. I'm Becca Dakini, and I'd like to welcome our next guest, Lyla June. Lyla June is an Indigenous musician, scholar, and community organizer. Her dynamic multi-genre presentation style has engaged audiences across the globe towards personal, collective, and ecological healing. She blends studies in human ecology at Stanford, graduate work in Indigenous pedagogy, and the traditional worldview she grew up with to inform her music, perspectives, and solutions. She is currently pursuing her doctoral degree, focusing on Indigenous food systems revitalization. So it's great to have you join us today for this show. Lyla, thanks for taking the time with us. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Great. I'd love you to introduce yourself and start to talk about how your work could be useful to those focused on planetary solutions and regeneration.
Yeah, so I think that what I'm trying to bring and broaden people's horizons with is an alternate conception of food. Food is not fully understood in the Indigenous context in terms of how vast, how complex, how sophisticated, and how diverse our food systems were in pre-Columbian times and still are in many communities. And so what I'm really trying to bring is to break out of this little box that says we have to grow food in agricultural plots, which is not necessarily out of the picture for me. I think that's important. And yet many Indigenous food systems were on more regional scales, bioregional scales, and I'll give a few examples of that. One thing that the Xiuhtezcatl Nation of British Columbia did was they plant these kelp forests throughout the coastline of Bella Bella, British Columbia. And these kelp forests increase the spawning grounds, the surface area that the herring fish can lay their roe. And this herring roe provides the foundation for not just humans and how they eat those eggs, but also the salmon, the killer whales, and the wolves, and everything up the river. So this is one way that we can break out of the box of what we consider food and really think about how can we create habitat for living beings, because that's the thing about the word food, right? It takes a deer and turns it into a bag of Cheetos, or it takes a black walnut tree and turns it into a little plastic bag of, almonds we buy at Whole Foods or whatever grocery store we go to. And so what I'm thinking is that instead of seeing things as objectified pieces of things that you buy at a grocery store, remember that these things that wrapped in plastic used to be living beings. They used to be a whole tree, or maybe they still are a whole tree producing nuts, or a whole deer. And so really thinking about how do we create habitat for those living beings, just like the Xiuhtezcatl Nation in British Columbia creates habitat for the herring. And they, instead of going out and domesticating and fencing the herring and turning it into like a artificial fishery, they actually just create habitat that the herring like, and the herring come to them. And so it's very much free will and consensual in a way. And we talk about consent culture and starting to honor each other's free will more in a deeper way. And I think that might extend to the ecological context and the food context of how can we, instead of trapping and domesticating and fencing and cultivating and growing monoculture crops and controlling every little thing, what if we simply do what many Indigenous nations have done, which is simply generate habitat for the living beings that we eat, that we call food, but are actually our relatives. So a lot of Native and Indigenous cultures, not just those of us who are brown, but even in Europe, where those Indigenous cultures were destroyed by Roman expansion, etc., we did not conceive of the things we ate as food as this secular dead object, but rather as our relatives. And so when you're eating your own relatives, you know, it almost sounds cannibalistic, but it's when you're eating your own relatives, think of how you would treat that system. It's much different. You would give it a lot more respect, a lot more freedom, and a lot more tenderness and care to create habitat so that they can have a beautiful life that they chose themselves to come to you. And the last example I'll use is the Great Plains. You know, in North America, the Great Plains is this big rolling grassland that extends all the way from Canada down to Texas. And it's famous because the buffalo obviously were a major food source for native peoples. But what people don't often understand is that the Great Plains were managed with fire. It was through intentional burning that the Plains tribes often have these lunar calendars, and some of them, their moon is called the grass burning moon, because every time at that time of year, they would do a burn. And these little patches of low intensity burns would inject phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen into the soil, creating these nutrient dense grasses. And then the buffalo love that. So people think we followed the buffalo, but also the buffalo followed us because we created the habitat that they liked. So that's one way I'm trying to sort of break open people's conception of what quote unquote food is and bring it into more of a relationship dynamic and practicing process.
Thanks, Lyla. You know, some of the dialogues that I've been hearing during this COVID kind of like great pause, people are calling it, is that humans are like a plague on the earth and you know should be removed, and you know the climate change kind of crisis that we're in, obviously that's sparking a lot of this solutions and regenerative movement. You know, talks a lot about how we need to find our place again in right relationship with the earth, and just some of your writing I've seen has been very much around this topic of how humans actually can be a part of the solution versus being seen as a plague. And I was just wondering if you had anything you'd like to share around that, particularly from an Indigenous perspective, and just any examples you have of you know land stewardship and how we can learn from those things within this movement.
Yeah, well, you see now that everyone's in quarantine, a lot of the dolphins are coming back and fish are swimming in Venice, you know, canals, and all of the coyotes are running through the city streets, and we're seeing the earth healing in our absence. And so I think that leads people to a misconception that humans are the problem and that if we just take them away, everything would be okay. But that does not align with my elders' teachings and, in my opinion, with reality, because one of my elders said, everything is here for a reason, Lyla. He said, every star, every tree, every rock, every horse, every blade of grass, and I'm following it, and then he looks at me and he says, and every human. You know, and that's really hard for us to wrap our heads around, that we are a part of creation. And also to understand that creator doesn't make mistakes. You know, creator doesn't just create things for no reason and they're like misfits of creation. We are actually here for a reason. We are here to steward the land, so much so that many communities take care of the land so well that if you were to take them away, the land would actually go into shock and the land would miss them. This is very similar to the notion of a keystone species. Beavers are considered keystone species where they create a dam, it creates a water source, and then you have fish coming, moose coming, all kinds of algae and different biomasses coming to create this whole habitat, such that if you destroy the beaver population, which is what happened in North America with the fur trade, you have all of these ecosystems collapsing and all of the animals that depended on the beaver go with it. So beavers and Native Americans are actually very similar because we both went through a genocide and we both were key components of the ecological processes around us, so much so that the biota around us came to depend on our cultural ecological practices. For instance, a lot of the oak trees in California are fire resistant. Their bark is fire resistant. That's because they've been co-evolving with human fire for so many millennia. And that's true for a lot of trees throughout North America. And many seeds, as you may know, are actually activated after fire. And so that's another piece of evidence showing that fire was so crucial, as it is in Australia, to upkeep the ecosystem. And one of the Yoruba elders from Africa, I overheard him speaking to a large crowd in Toronto, and he said human beings in our language, our word for them is, I don't remember the word, but the translation is chosen ones. And at first that sounded strange to me, like, oh, we're chosen ones. Like, is this some kind of like hierarchy, like we're better than the rest of creation? And then he explained further, and it made sense, is that no, we were chosen by Creator to be the stewards of the land around us. And so I thought, maybe that is it, that we have these big brains not to take over the world, but as my friend Mendahi Bastida says, to take care of the world. And so we have a specific ecological role, just like the beaver. We're here for a reason. And a lot of these plants, they need us. They need us to propagate their seeds. And maybe that's part of why Creator gave us these hands, these opposable fingers, these opposable thumbs rather, is because the plants need us to help them propagate, to help them live in a healthy way, to not let the forests get choked out. Because when you leave the forests alone, you don't thin them, you don't burn them. Contrary to popular belief, it's actually bad for the forest because you have this overgrowth. One of the elders in Santa Cruz, California, and I'll just end with this story, he said that our traditional practice is to have about 14 trees per acre. He says, now I go out on the land, because we've lost all of our land, to Santa Cruz, California city, and I see 400 trees per acre. I see the forest so densely populated. And he said, people don't understand. There's limited nutrients and limited water and limited sunlight in that forest. And if you have 400 trees on an acre, you have a lot of unhealthy trees with weakened immune systems. And then you have bugs that can wipe them out. You have catastrophic fires because everything is so close together and dry because there's limited water and climate change. You have catastrophic fires in California, blah, blah, blah. So there's actually a real need for the human touch to be on the land. And so that's why I'm trying to counter this narrative amid the COVID crisis that human beings are the problem, and now that we're away, the earth is fine, but saying, no, we need to re-engage with the earth, but in a completely different way that is regenerative, restorative, collaborative, and feeds not just us, but feeds everything around us.
Beautiful. Thank you, Lyla. I wonder if you have any tips or pointers or ideas for how our viewers can actually find their weave or find their way back into connection with the earth, any particular practices. You know, I believe, it seems to me from what I'm learning humbly, that innately this is an indigenous understanding, which seems to have been lost in a lot of other cultures and ways. So just, you know, it would be great to hear from you and be able to take that leadership, I guess, within the community to understand how can we learn the right way to be again, and how can we learn to be in relationship with the planet in the right way. So yeah, just any points for viewers for how they can reconnect and start to listen and walk the right way.
Right, right. Well, I think there are many ways we can begin to come into a deeper practice of relationship with the earth, particularly regenerative practices. I can think of quite a few right now, but one of them is to develop solidarity with the indigenous peoples of your area. And the way you do that, in my opinion, and what a lot of people are saying, is you go to the nation humbly and you even ask before you ask if it's okay to ask. Say, may I ask you how I may be in solidarity? That's how our old elders used to do this, apparently. You know, I'm not talking about between races or anything, just in general. We were so conscious of the consent process and the free will process that we would even ask to ask. And so when we ask to ask, may I ask you some questions about how to be in solidarity with your nation? So then that's step one. Step two is the second question is, how, if at all, may I help your nation? And we say nations, we're starting to say nations instead of tribes because the full breadth and sophistication and complexity of our nations is not fully, the connotation isn't there when you say tribe always. So anyways, how, if at all, may I help? And, and then following the leadership of that local community. And it might not make sense to you at first, but if you just give it some time and patience, you might learn a lot. Like for instance, you might go to the Miwok community in the Bay Area, Northern Bay Area, and say, how may I help, if at all? And they say, well, we need diapers for our mothers because they're all broke because they all lost their jobs. And you think to yourself, oh man, I wanted to do a permaculture project, but maybe, just maybe, even though diapers are made out of plastic, even though all this stuff, that's what they need right now. And just following that lead and saying, okay, well, let me do a fundraiser for diapers for the mothers who can't take care of their kids very well right now. That's when you get to step two, is you have built that trust. And then once you start hanging out with these folks, you might realize like, oh, wow, they have these ceremonies that help keep this whole oak forest intact. And so slowly but surely, you'll start to learn through osmosis the regenerative practices of that land and that place to become more participatory in that regenerative practice. So that's one thing, is how to become more in solidarity with the indigenous nation around you, especially, and this is a part that a lot of white folks miss, especially given the historical context that we're working in. You might not see it because we're like these fish swimming in colonization. We don't even realize how racist and how oppressive and how horrific this whole system really is, because we've kind of become numb to it and it's just become normal. But if you really denormalize this, you will realize that Native people, take California for example, were hunted for money just a little over 100 years ago, and now are shoved on these little tiny rancherias, struggling to survive, and that the genocide has not even begun to finish. It's ongoing. And so when you look at it through that lens, you're like, oh, okay, it's actually part of healing the earth is healing our relationship to indigenous peoples and healing the situation and righting historical wrongs. So that's one way. And obviously I'm acting as if I'm speaking to a non-indigenous audience when I say come into solidarity with the indigenous peoples of your backyard, because usually these talks are for non-indigenous peoples. And I know we are all indigenous to a place, but what I mean is we may not have that long-standing, thousands and thousands of years old connection to the land we're on, and we are guests. And as guests, we should perhaps consult with our host and see how we can be respectful guests. Secondly, a way that we can all become more participatory in regenerative practices, this might sound silly, but, plant a seed, watch it grow, see what it takes to grow a bean plant, see what it takes to grow an oak tree, see what it takes to grow a fig tree. Start becoming familiar with that process. Even if you're a complete novice and you just are experimenting, and be willing to fail, your field might die. That's okay. That's how we learn. But start even the smallest thing, plant a seed, and try and understand the process of a living being coming to maturity to give you food or beauty or herbs or medicines, whatever it is. I think that's a really good thing that a lot of us are starting to do amid the corona crisis. Thirdly, I think starting to look at the land around you through that lens of, wow, food is such an expansive, beautiful thing. How can I break out of this paradigm that food is what you buy on a shelf? And how can a lot of foraging, I think foraging is wonderful, but also broadcasting the seeds of the plants that you forage so that they're there next year. Things like that, I think, are ways we can get back into it.
Thank you so much, Lyla. I wonder if you would share with us some of the projects and initiatives that you're working on at the moment that may be of interest to our viewers.
Yeah, so we have a GoFundMe, which is specifically for Native families. There was a woman who lost her job because of coronavirus. She couldn't pay the electricity, all of her meat defrosted, and she doesn't have food for the month. A Lakota woman from Rapid City has 5 kids, has coronavirus. Her husband got laid off because you can't work when your wife has coronavirus, or you might bring it to the workplace. And they couldn't pay rent, So we're doing emergency micro grants through this project that we call the COVID-19 Native Relief Fund. We'll provide a link where you can donate to that if you like. A lot of indigenous peoples in North America do not have these rainy day funds. A lot of us don't even really know what that means because we've been living paycheck to paycheck, or however we survive really in this little concentration camps that they call reservations, and trying to overcome our financial hardships. So that's one way you can help. I think other than that, just you can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Lyla, it's all Lyla June, and just maybe stay in touch because we have a lot of calls to action all the time to help different tribes. The Mashpee Wampanoag is another project that I'm working on with the tribe to stop the Trump administration from dissolving their tribal lands in the middle of this pandemic. So I think just following me and the Dream Warriors is the management group that I work with, and keeping an eye out for information and calls to action.
Thanks, Lyla. Well, we're coming to the end of our time. Is there any last words or thoughts that you'd like to share? And then I understand you may have a song for us today to close, but anything else you wanted to add, around this conversation, about where we're headed on the planet as Earth stewards in this regenerative moment and decade, as we focus on trying to right the wrongs, or I guess clean up our mess that we've made. Anything else that comes to mind, just want to express a lot of gratitude to you for really bringing such a strong Indigenous voice and wisdom forward at this time as part of this learning. But yeah, anything you'd like to add to just as some closing words?
Thank you. And thanks for supporting my nation. And I know I'm not the only spokeswoman or spokesman about this topic, so continue to hear from all the other voices that are out there. But I guess the last thing I just say before I share a little song is that we've been through this before. Collapse, collapse is something that a lot of different human communities have experienced, albeit never before on this scale. But my own people are related to the Chaco Canyon people, and that civilization fell like a ton of bricks, and it was because we were deviating from the righteous path. And so that's one good thing about this world, this earth, is that unrighteousness can't really last here. It runs its course and it dies, and that's what we're experiencing. But the beauty of every death of unrighteousness is that we learn things we couldn't have learned any other way. We learn, oh wow, that didn't work. We better come up with a new way of living. So I'll just say that is that this collapse is huge. It is global. It's probably unlike anything the earth has ever seen, and it is part of the learning process of being human and being alive on this Mother Earth, where the project is to learn how to love. And we're learning very well how not to love, which helps us then learn how to love. Okay, I'll just sing a little song. Okay, so, oh, I got this from Byron Bay. It's a kangaroo. So I carry a little bit of that medicine with me wherever I go. But that's where you and I first met, seemingly long ago. And this song is just about boarding schools. In Australia, you know, the stolen generation, taking the children away. And in Canada, the residential schools, and how that had an impact on my family lineage and my life and things like that. So. When I was a little girl in the schools, yeah, they had me fooled. They said your native culture, it ain't got nothing for you. And if you want success, get a gold star, be the best. So I left my culture behind, and I went to the best school I could find. When my grandmother was a little girl in the boarding schools, yeah, they had her fooled. They said that her dark skin was original sin, and if she wanted to be saved, then in Jesus' name she prayed. So she left for college on a train, and she read her Bible every day. But you can't cut this down, there's no stopping us now. Head held high, feet on the ground, we know who we are now and we're proud. Elder songs, we hear the sound, we hear the sound, we hear the sound, we hear the sound. So when I have my little girl, she'll have everything she needs. She'll have a choice of who to be. She can speak her native language, and she can still love her neighbor, love the color of her skin, and see the beauty that lies within. Because we remember who we are, and that supremacy was a lie from the start. You can't cut this down, there's no stopping us now. Head held high, feet on the ground, we know who we are now and we're proud. Elder songs, we hear the sound. So thank you for listening to that, and thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Lyla June. It's an absolute honor to speak with you today, and thank you for your amazing work that you're doing. If people want to stay in touch with you, what's your direct website?
LylaJuneJohnston.com, LylaJuneJohnston.com, and Facebook's always a good way too. So thank you.
Wonderful. Lyla, thank you again. I'm Becca Dakini. You have been watching Voices of the Regenerative Decade here on One Earth Live.